The entire floor had gone silent. Not quiet, silent. Grace opened the door anyway. The man standing by the window didn't turn immediately. He didn't have to. Every single person in that room was already pressed against the wall, like breathing near him was a risk they weren't sure they could afford. Mr. Kang, powerful, arrogant Mr. Kang, was shaking. His hands, actually shaking. Then the man turned, and his eyes found Grace like he already knew exactly where she'd be standing. Her heart did something she couldn't explain. Mr. Kang's voice cracked behind her. "See, Chairman, she's nobody. She was just leaving." "Your father?" Grace heard herself say. "You're my boss's father? This is insane." The smile that crossed the stranger's face was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. Welcome to Afro-Korean Chronicle TV, where love crosses every border and secrets never stay buried. If powerful romance, dangerous men, and stories that keep you up past midnight are your weakness, hit that like button, subscribe right now, and drop "I'm ready" in the comments. Because this one will wreck you completely. Let's go. 6 months before that door flew open, Grace Adeyemi landed in Seoul with one suitcase, emergency money sewn into the lining of her bag, and a pride so deep in her bones that struggling in front of anyone had never once felt like an option. Lagos had built her that way. Her mother, Faith, had built her that way. Quietly, consistently, through years of watching a woman who never once asked the world to feel sorry for her. You carry your weight. You solve your problems. You do not put your pain on someone else's table. Seoul was not Lagos. Clean, cold, precise. A city that moved at a speed that assumed you were already keeping up. Grace kept up. Every morning, chin lifted, real feelings locked somewhere deep and inaccessible. She moved through it like she had always belonged. The plan was simple. Work at Kang Industries as a junior logistics coordinator. Send 60% of every paycheck home to Faith. Eat cheaply. Save carefully. Renew the visa. Don't complain, don't ask, don't give anyone a reason to look at her like she was temporary. For the first 3 months, the plan worked. Then the salary stopped clearing. Not canceled, not denied. Simply delayed. Always being processed. Always almost ready. "Always one more week, Miss Adeyemi. Please be patient. These things take time." She was patient in the way that costs a person sleep, costs them meals, costs them the small dignities that hold a life together. She ate instant noodles 4 nights a week. She stopped buying the good soap. She walked instead of taking the subway. She did all of this quietly, without complaint, without letting a single person see. And every Sunday, she called Faith. Faith picked up on the second ring. Always. Like she had been sitting right beside the phone, waiting for exactly this moment. And Grace performed. "Seoul is beautiful, Mummy. The parks here, you would love them. Are you eating well? You sound thin." "You cannot sound thin. I'm fine." "Grace Adeyemi. Mummy, tell me about you." And Faith would talk. About the neighborhood, the woman next door, the small texture of a life lived quietly. And Grace would close her eyes and hold the phone with both hands and feel, for exactly those minutes, like the ocean between them was something survivable. The moment she hung up, the feeling left. She would sit in her apartment, the size of her mother's sitting room back home, open the notebook of calculations, stare at numbers that never added up, and whisper to the empty room, "This is temporary. This is temporary." Like a prayer, she was trying to convince herself to keep believing. But then one evening, she stayed late and heard 2 HR officers talking in the corridor outside the records room. She wasn't trying to listen. She was simply there, frozen, documents pressed to her chest. "How long are we holding the foreign worker payments?" "Long enough they don't file a complaint, not long enough to become a legal problem." A pause, a low laugh that made her skin cold. "Kang's orders? Who else?" Grace stood in that corridor long after their footsteps disappeared. 3 months, not a delay, not an error, a decision, made comfortably, deliberately, that her rent, her mother's medication money, the careful structure of her survival, was simply a tool to keep her compliant. She went home, sat on her kitchen floor, stayed there until the tiles left marks on the backs of her legs. Then she stood up, printed the calculation sheet, and set it on the counter where she would see it first thing in the morning. Tomorrow, she was walking into Mr. Kang's office. She was not leaving without an answer. What Grace did not know was that 6 weeks earlier, Kang Industries had been quietly acquired by a conglomerate so powerful the deal had never appeared in a newspaper. That the man who now owned the building she worked in had reviewed every internal file within 72 hours, had seen the foreign worker salary records, had seen her name. Had stopped on that page, in a private office only he was ever allowed to enter alone, for longer than any other page in the file. Not because it was the most important page, because something about Grace Adeyemi felt like a question he had already been asked and not yet answered. He had turned the page eventually, but he had come back to it 3 times before morning. The morning Grace walked into Mr. Kang's office, she wore her best blazer. Not to impress anyone, was steady. Her heart was doing something was steady. Her heart was doing something considerably less steady, but that was nobody's business. She walked past the secretary without stopping, pushed the door open, and the silence hit her like a wall. She had not rehearsed this room, had not rehearsed the executives pressed against the far wall with their eyes fixed on the floor, had not rehearsed the air, thick and electric and wrong in a way she felt before she understood, had not rehearsed Mr. Kang standing behind his own desk, his face the color of old paper, his hands gripping the edge like it was the only solid thing left in his world, and she had not, could not have, rehearsed him. The man by the window turned fully, and Grace felt the full weight of his attention like something physical. Mid-30s, sharp features. A stillness that wasn't peace. It was control. The kind that didn't come from calm. The kind that came from never needing to raise your voice because every person in the room had already calculated the cost of disappointing you and found the number too high. This was not a businessman. This was something older and darker than a businessman. And every person in that room except Grace already knew it. His eyes moved over her face with a quiet, careful attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and studied. She did not look away. Something shifted in his expression. Small, almost invisible. Like a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found something he didn't have a category for yet. Chairman Kwan, this is just one of our junior coordinators. She wasn't aware. I can speak for myself. Grace turned just enough to meet Mr. Kang's eyes. 3 months, Mr. Kang. I have the figures right here. Mr. Kang stared at her like she had walked to the edge of a cliff and waved at the bottom. Chairman Kwan made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something quieter and more dangerous than a laugh. Leave us. 2 words, barely a murmur. Every executive moved for the door like the building was on fire. Mr. Kang began to follow, and Chairman Kwan said, without looking at him, "Not you." Mr. Kang stopped, swallowed, stayed. The door closed. 3 of them, alone. The room felt simultaneously larger and much, much smaller. You came here, he said quietly, for your salary. 3 months of it. She placed the sheet on the desk without breaking eye contact. With the dates, figures, and relevant employment clauses. It's all there. Show me. She crossed the room and held it out. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch, but the almost of it registered somewhere in her chest before she could stop it. He read it. All of it. Carefully. The room so quiet she could hear Mr. Kang breathing too fast behind them both. Then Chairman Kwan set the paper down and looked at Mr. Kang for the first time since Grace had entered the room. He didn't say anything. He simply looked. And Mr. Kang, who had made Grace feel small every single day for 6 months, crumbled like something that had never been as solid as it appeared. Chairman, I can explain. It was a processing issue, a clearance timeline issue. I was going to resolve it this week. You have been skimming. Chairman Kwan's voice was very soft. From the foreign worker salary accounts. For how long? Not a question. 8 months. 8 months. Grace felt the number land in her chest like something dropped from a great height. 8 months. There were others. She had not been the only one. "You will have everything you are owed by end of business today," he said, turning back to Grace. With interest. She looked at the absolute certainty in his face, at the way he had resolved in 40 seconds what 6 months of her patience and dignity had failed to move even slightly. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt the first thread of something uncomfortable pulling at the edge of all this. Because men like this, in her experience, did not do things for nothing. And men like this, men whose presence made entire floors of people press against walls, operated by rules she hadn't been handed. "Why?" she asked. The room went still. "Why what? Why are you helping me?" Something moved across his face, there and gone, too fast to name. For just 1 second, behind all that terrifying control, something flickered. He looked at her like she was something he didn't have a category for and wasn't sure yet whether he minded. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and something changed, a tightening around the eyes, subtle and quick, the kind that only showed on faces that had trained themselves not to show anything. He turned slightly away and answered. "Nay." A pause. His voice dropped lower. "Ani, gujon andwe." Another pause, longer this time. Whatever was being said on the other end was costing him something. Grace watched his jaw set, watched his free hand close into a loose fist at his side. "Najonge." He hung up. He stood still for a moment with his back to the room. Then he turned around and he was composed again, perfectly, completely, like the last 30 seconds hadn't happened at all. But Grace had seen the fist. She filed it somewhere careful. "Your salary will clear today. You have my word." And then, because she was Faith's daughter, because she had been built for exactly this. Grace Adeyemi looked the most dangerous man in Seoul directly in the eye and said, "I don't know you well enough to know what your word is worth." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Mr. Kang looked like he might actually faint, and Chairman Kwon Ji-hun, who ran Seoul's most feared criminal network from behind the clean face of a conglomerate, who had not been surprised by anything or anyone in longer than he could remember, smiled. Not the dangerous smile from before, something smaller, something that reached his eyes this time, something that, if Grace had been paying less careful attention to keeping her own face neutral, might have stopped her breath entirely. The salary cleared at 4:47 p.m. that same day. Grace read the alert twice, then a third time. The full 3 months, every one, May calculated to the last decimal, plus an additional amount that made her sit very still for a long moment. Interest. He had meant it literally. She told herself the feeling moving through her chest was simply relief. Nothing complicated. Nothing that had anything to do with dark eyes that had found her across a room like they already knew where she'd be standing. She transferred the money to Faith, then went back to work, like nothing had happened. 3 days passed. On the first day, Mr. Kang greeted her in the hallway, a small, stiff nod, the greeting of a man who had been made to understand something without being told it twice. Grace nodded back and kept walking. On the second day, the immigration warning sitting on her file, the one she had been losing sleep over for 2 months, the one that could have unraveled everything, simply disappeared. An email arrived. Visa status reviewed and confirmed. No further action required. Grace read it 4 times. On the third day, Faith called on a Wednesday. "Faith, what's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Why must something be wrong? The hospital called this morning. Someone paid for my tests. All of them. The ones Dr. Fashola said we should do, but I told him we would wait." Grace went completely still. "What do you mean someone paid?" "Anonymous. Grace, those tests were not cheap. Who would—" "I'll call you back, Mummy." She hung up before Faith could hear what was happening to her breathing. The salary, that was business. The immigration warning, a man with his reach touching a government file, wasn't difficult to believe. But her mother in Lagos. Her mother's name, in a hospital system, in a country that Kwon Ji-hoon had no reason to be looking at, except that he had been looking. Deeply enough to find something Grace had never told a single person in Seoul, that Faith was sick, that the tests had been postponed because the money wasn't there. Grace picked up her bag and walked to the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped in. They began to close, and then a hand appeared between them. Ji-hoon stepped in, alone. No security, no assistant, just him in a dark coat, looking like he had somewhere more important to be, and had chosen not to go there. He pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. 12 floors of silence. Grace stared straight ahead. She was aware of him the way you were aware of a fire in your peripheral vision, not looking directly at it, but feeling the heat regardless. You transferred the money home within 4 minutes of it clearing. Grace turned her head slowly. You were watching my bank account. I was watching the transfer confirmation on the company's end. A pause. 4 minutes is fast. My mother needed it. Something moved across his face, there and gone. I know, he said quietly. The elevator reached the lobby. Neither of them moved for exactly 2 seconds, 2 seconds that felt considerably longer, and then Grace stepped out without a word and stood on the pavement in the cold Seoul air and breathed. The company dinner was 3 days later, and Grace was not supposed to attend. Then her supervisor got food poisoning, and she was the next name on the list. And that was how she found herself in a private dining room on the 32nd floor of a hotel she couldn't have afforded to stand outside of, wearing the one good dress she had brought from Lagos, sitting 3 seats away from a man she had been successfully avoiding for the better part of a week. Ji-hoon sat at the head of the table like he had been placed there by someone who understood geometry. He hadn't looked at her when she arrived. She hadn't looked at him. They had both been extremely professional about not looking at each other, and Grace suspected she was not the only one exerting effort. Then the gift came. A senior executive leaned across and presented Grace with a small lacquered box, beautifully wrapped, expensive in the way that whispered rather than announced. For our international colleague, a welcome. The table smiled, waited. Grace looked at the box and thought of her mother's voice. When someone gives you something you cannot repay, Grace, you are already in debt before you open it. She smiled at the executive, warm, genuine, unhurried. That is so very kind of you, but I cannot accept it. The thought is more than enough. The table went quiet in the way that meant something had happened that nobody knew how to process. And Grace picked up her glass and took a calm sip of water and did not look toward the head of the table. But she felt it. The attention, specific and steady and warm in a way that was different from being watched. She felt Ji-hoon looking at her the way you feel sunlight shift direction, not seeing it happen, simply feeling the warmth land somewhere new. Her hand, holding the glass, was not entirely steady. Later, after the executives had filtered out, she waited alone for the elevator. Gift, he said. Yes. Most people gift, he said. Yes. Most people don't. Most people aren't me. A pause. She watched the floor numbers descend. Where did you learn that? His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the corporate register. Genuinely curious in a way that felt almost private. My mother, Grace said. The doors opened. She stepped out. At the hotel door, with an expression she didn't have a name, with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, something open and unguarded that she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see on his face. She turned back to the night and walked into it, and told herself very firmly that her heart was not doing what it was doing. Grace made it 4 days before she stopped avoiding him. Well, not because she ran out of willpower. She had survived 3 months of stolen salary on willpower alone. She stopped because of the photograph. It came in a box from Lagos. Things from home her aunt had sent at Faith's request. A wrapper fabric, ground crayfish, some photographs from when Grace was small, and at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in an old piece of cloth. A photograph Grace had never seen. Her mother, young, laughing in a way Grace had never quite seen Faith laugh, completely open, completely unguarded, like the person behind the camera was someone she trusted with the full weight of herself. The background was unmistakably Seoul. Faith had never once mentioned it. Grace held the photograph with both hands and felt something cold and quiet move through her. There was someone else in it, standing beside Faith, slightly cut off at the edge of the frame. A shoulder, a hand. At the bottom of the box. The one of at the bottom of the box. The one of Mummy in Seoul. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm her aunt knew which photograph she meant. Grace, who is she standing with? It was a long time ago. Auntie, your mother lived there briefly, before you were born. She left suddenly. She never spoke about it, whatever happened there. It changed her. Changed her how? Careful, her aunt said softly. She became very careful. Grace sat in her kitchen and looked at the photograph and thought about a version of her mother she had never known, young and laughing and trusting someone with the full, unguarded weight of her smile. Then she stood up and picked up her bag. She found him on the 42nd floor. She had never been. It required clearance she didn't possess. She walked to the elevator, pressed 42 and waited. The elevator took her straight up without stopping. She found out later that Ji-hun had told security, weeks ago, that if Grace Adeyemi ever approached a restricted area, they were to let her through. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she put it in the same careful place she was storing several other things about Kwon Ji-hun she hadn't yet decided how to feel about. She knocked twice and walked in without waiting. Na Ji-hun looked up. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to the expression of a man whose phone had rung and the name on the screen was the one he'd been waiting for without admitting he was waiting. Grace crossed the room and placed the photograph on his desk. He looked at it, and she watched something happen to his face that she had not seen before. A crack, real and deep, moving through all that control like a fault line shifting. His jaw tightened. I sent it. She was here, Ji-hun. In Seoul sent it. She was here, Ji-hun, in Seoul. In 1997, she never told me. It was the first time she had used his name. Neither of them acknowledged it, but the air in the room changed, and they both felt it change, and neither of them looked away. I know, he said. What do you mean you know? He opened the drawer on his left side, slowly, caked like a man who had been deciding whether to open it for some time and had only just made up his mind. He placed a second photograph on the desk beside hers. Same skyline, same river, same faded colors, different angle, but the same two people, her mother, and the partially visible figure Grace had not been able to identify. In Ji-hun's photograph, taken from the other side, the second figure was fully visible. Grace looked at the face, then at Ji-hun, then at the face again. The resemblance was not subtle. The jaw, the stillness, the eyes. That's your father, she said. Yes. How long have you known? Long enough, he said quietly, that finding you at Kang Industries was not the accident I let you believe it was. The room went completely still. Grace felt something move through her chest, the specific ache of realizing that something you thought was random had been arranged. That you had been a destination someone was moving toward while you were simply trying to survive. You came looking for me, she said. I came to see if you were real. His voice, stripped of everything professional and controlled, was the most honest sound she had heard from him yet. Your name was in my father's files, written down and underlined and never explained. I needed to know why. And now you know. No. Now I have more questions than I started with. She picked up her photograph, left his on the desk. Don't make decisions about me, she said quietly, without telling me. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard the smallest sound, a shift of weight, a breath, and she knew without turning around that he had taken a step toward her. She didn't turn around, but she slowed, just slightly, for just one moment before she walked through the door. And Kwon Ji-hun stood in the middle of his office with one foot forward and watched her leave and did not take another step. And the space between where he stood and where she had been felt suddenly, like the longest distance he had ever failed to cross. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay in her apartment with the photograph propped against the water glass on her bedside table and stared at her mother's young face in the dark and tried to build a version of events that made sense. Faith had been in Seoul. Faith had known Ji-hoon's father. Faith had left suddenly and come back different, careful, and had never spoken about it once. Not in all the years Grace was growing up, not in all the Sunday calls, not in all the late nights when Faith would sit at the kitchen table after she thought Grace was asleep and exist quietly with whatever she was carrying. Grace had always thought her mother's quietness was simply her nature. Now she wondered what else it had been. She picked up her phone at 2 a.m. and almost called Faith, held it for a long time, thumb hovering over her mother's name. Then she put it down. Not yet. She needed to know more before she asked questions she couldn't take back. Behind her closed eyes, uninvited and unhelpful, was Ji-hoon's face across the desk, the crack in his composure. The way he had said, "I came to see if you were real," like she had been a rumor he'd spent years half believing. She pressed her face into the pillow and told herself very firmly to stop thinking about that. It didn't work. The next morning, she went straight to the one person in Kang Industries she actually trusted. Min Ji, a senior records coordinator who knew where every document in the building lived. "I need archived records, corporate history, anything going back to 1997. Minji looked at her carefully. "Those records are in the restricted archive. Sub-level 2. "I'm not asking you to get them. I'm asking if they exist." Minji set her coffee down. "They exist, but you didn't hear that from me." She paused. "Whatever you're looking for, be sure you want to find it. Some of those files were supposed to be destroyed. The fact that they weren't means someone kept them on purpose." Grace walked away with the feeling of a person who has just been told the rabbit hole goes considerably deeper than it looked from the surface. Why, she didn't go to sub-level 2, because she already had access to the one person who had read everything. She went back to the 42nd floor. She knocked once, walked in, and Ji-hoon looked up. This time the expression on his face was something she could name. Relief, brief and unguarded, there for exactly 1 second before everything else covered it. He had been waiting. He hadn't known it until she walked through the door. Grace was paying close attention. She sat across from him without being invited and placed both hands flat on the desk. "Tell me about your father. All of it. Not the version in the press. The real version." Ji-hoon looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back, not away from her but settling, like a man deciding to put down something heavy he had been carrying standing up. And he talked. Yo Kwon Dae-jung had built his empire the way most empires got built, through genuine brilliance and a complete willingness to operate in spaces where the law became suggestive rather than mandatory. By the late 1990s, he had legitimate holdings across 6 industries and a criminal network underneath that moved money, favors, and occasionally people through channels that appeared in no annual report and answered to no government. Men who crossed him didn't get fired. They simply stopped appearing in conversations. He had gone to Lagos in 1996. "Why Lagos?" Grace asked. "A deal. There was a man there who controlled import routes, who could move things across borders without questions. Your uncle, Grace. His name is in my father's files 47 times. My uncle Benjamin. Yes. And my mother?" Ji-hoon's jaw tightened slightly. "Your mother worked for my father, in Seoul, 1997. She was brought here as part of the arrangement with your uncle. That mean? It means something changed, that mean. It means something changed. My father's files from that period are incomplete. Pages missing. Not lost. Removed. Someone took them deliberately. Your father. Or someone protecting him." Grace thought about Faith coming home different. Careful. A version of her mother that had learned, in this city, to hold things close and never let them show on her face. "She was protecting herself," Grace said quietly. "Whatever happened, she left and made sure there was nothing on paper that could follow her." "Yes, that's what I believe. But something did follow her." Yes. The word sat between them like something with weight. Your father, she said carefully. Is he died 4 years ago. Quiet. Flat. The flatness of something processed alone, in private, completely. He left me the company, both versions of it. Did you want it? The question surprised him. She could see it. The slight widening of his eyes, the pause, the sense of a man being asked something nobody had thought to ask. No, he said. One word. Honest in a way that cost him something. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, warm and inconvenient. Moving through the carefully maintained distance she had been keeping between herself and everything she felt when she looked at this man. She looked away before it showed on her face. 3 weeks ago, Ji-hun said, I found a name in the margin of one of the remaining pages, written in my father's handwriting. He turned the folder around and slid it across the desk toward her. Whose name? His expression was careful now, not the dangerous careful of a powerful man managing information. The careful of someone about to hand another person something fragile, very aware that once handed over it could not be taken back. Yours, he said quietly. Your name, Grace, written 4 years before you were born. The room tilted. Grace pressed her hands harder against the desk. That's not possible, she said. I know. And yet. And Grace Adeyemi, who had survived Lagos and Seoul and 3 months of stolen salary and the specific loneliness of performing okayness for the person she loved most in the world, felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely afraid, not of Ji-hun, of what his father had known, and of what her mother had spent 28 years making sure she didn't. Grace stared at the folder without touching it. Her name, written in a dead man's handwriting, and 4 years before she existed. Ji-hun didn't rush her. He sat with his hands folded and waited, not passive, not patient, but present, completely, entirely present in a way that most people never managed and that Grace found, despite everything, more disarming than anything else about him. She opened the folder. The document was old, paper yellowed at the edges, handwriting dense and precise. Korean characters filled most of the page. At the bottom, in the margin, Adi written quickly like a thought that needed capturing before it escaped. 2 words in English. Grace Adeyemi, her full name, spelled correctly. Below it, a specific date, day, month, year, that made her breath stop completely. Her birthday. He knew when I would be born, she said. Her voice came out very steady. She was distantly impressed by this. Your father knew my birthday before I was born. Yes. How? Not a question. The sound of a person demanding that the world make sense. My father kept a record of a promise he made in Lagos in 1996, to your Uncle Benjamin. The business arrangement came with a condition. Grace read the relevant line twice, then looked up. A marriage arrangement, she said flatly. Yes. Between his son and Benjamin's niece, when the time came. The silence that followed was the loudest Grace had ever sat inside. She closed the folder, placed both hands on top of it. Is arranged before I was born. That you arranged before I was born. That you and I would... Grace, she looked at him. His face was open in a way she had never seen it. Stripped of everything, all the control and the careful management of what he allowed people to see. He looked exactly like what he was underneath all of it. A man sitting across from a woman who had walked into his life and rearranged everything he thought he understood about why. I didn't know. Not the full arrangement. Not until 3 weeks ago. But you knew enough to come looking for me. I knew your name was in the file. I didn't know it was this. Does it change things? Grace asked. For you. The question hung between them. Ji-hun looked at her long enough that she felt it move across her skin like something physical. It changes the explanation, he said quietly. It doesn't change anything else. Grace felt those words land somewhere she wasn't prepared for. She felt them settle, mean something she wasn't ready to examine in front of him. She stood. picked up the folder. "I'm keeping this." She walked to the door and stopped, not because she planned to, but because her body made a decision her mind hadn't approved yet. "Ji-hun." "Yes." She kept her back to him. It was easier. "Why didn't you tell me when you first saw me? Why did you let me believe it was an accident?" A pause so long she almost turned around. "Because I wanted you to choose to be in the same room as me, not because of an arrangement, not because of something our families decided before either of us could speak." Another pause. "Well, I wanted it to be real." Grace stood at the door and felt something break open in her chest. Warm and aching and terrifying in equal measure, the specific feeling of a wall developing a crack it cannot close. She left without turning around. Seo Yeon was waiting in the corridor. Grace pulled up short, found herself face to face with the woman who moved through Ji-hun's world with the ease of long familiarity, who wore her connection to him like something inherited rather than earned. Seo Yeon looked at the folder in Grace's hands, at Grace's face, at whatever was written there that Grace hadn't managed to put away yet. She smiled, small, civil. "Miss Adeyemi, Miss Seo. He's extraordinary, isn't he?" Not a question. The tone of someone sharing an observation made long ago. "He makes everyone feel like the only person in the room." Is that what he does? It's what he's always done. Something moved behind her eyes, not cruelty. Our past Grace toward Ji-hun's office without past Grace toward Ji-hun's office without another word. Grace watched her go. Then she walked to the elevator and stood there with the folder pressed against her chest like it contained something living, something that needed to be kept safe from anyone who knew what to do with it. Her phone rang. Ji-hun's private number. "There's something else," he said. No greeting, like they were already mid-conversation, like it had never actually stopped. "Something I found this morning, in the last section of the file, the section that was partially destroyed." "What is it?" "Not on the phone." "Ji-hun." "Come back up," he said quietly. "Please." The please. She had never heard him say it before. She hadn't known he owned the word. And something about the way it came, unpolished, unplanned, arriving before he could decide whether to send it, made her press 42 before she had consciously decided to. She pushed the door open. Ji-hun was standing beside the window, the same window he had been standing at the first day she ever saw him. He turned when she entered. In his hand was a single sheet of paper. His face told her, before he said a word, that whatever was on it was going to change something. He crossed the room. I stopped in front of her, closer than he had ever stood. Close enough that she could see the specific dark of his eyes and the thing moving in them that she had been calling composure but was beginning to understand was something else entirely. Something that had been building since the first day she walked into a room and didn't look away. He held out the paper. She took it. Their fingers touched, briefly, barely, and neither of them moved for the half-second that it lasted. She read the first line, looked up. "This says my mother didn't leave Seoul voluntarily. This says your father asked her to stay." "Yes, and she refused. Why? What was she refusing?" Ji-hun looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just found the person he was always going to have to hand it to. "She was refusing," he said softly, "to give you up." The world stopped. "What?" she whispered. "My father wanted to raise you here, in Seoul, as a guarantee that the deal between the families would hold. Your mother was supposed to leave you behind when she went back to Lagos." Grace felt the folder slip from her fingers, heard it hit the floor, didn't look down. "She took me anyway," Grace said. "She took you anyway, in the middle of the night, with nothing, and she never came back." And then, for the first time since any of this began, she felt her eyes fill. She did not let them fall, but Ji-hun saw. And without a word, without asking, without making it a decision, he closed the remaining distance and put his arms around her. Grace stood rigid for exactly 3 seconds. Then something in her, something held tightly for a very long time, longer maybe than these 6 months in Seoul, longer maybe than she knew. Let go. She leaned into him, just slightly, just enough. Ming and Ji-hoon held her like she was something he had been looking for in his father's files for 4 years and had only just understood he would never find on paper. Outside the window, Seoul moved on, enormous and indifferent. Inside the room, something set in motion in 1997 by 2 people making desperate decisions in the dark arrived, quietly, at the place it had always been heading. Grace pulled back first. Not because she wanted to, because wanting to was exactly the problem. She stepped back and picked up the folder and pressed it against her chest and looked at the window instead of him, because looking at him right now felt like standing too close to something she didn't yet have the right protective gear for. "I need to call my mother," she said. "I know. She lied to me, my whole life." "She protected you," Ji-hoon said quietly. "There's a difference." Grace looked at him, sharp, instinctive, ready to push back. But his face held no argument. Only the steady recognition of a man who had spent 4 years untangling the difference between what a parent does to protect a child and what it costs the child to find out. She understood suddenly he was not just talking about Faith. "Your father. You're still untangling it too." The silence was its own answer. "Every day," he said finally. "Ji-hoon. Yes. I don't know what any of this means yet. Us, this, whatever this is." "I know," he said. "But I'm not running from it." The room went very still. "Neither am I," he said. She called Faith from the lobby, stood in the corner near the glass doors with Seoul moving past outside and her heart hammering. Faith picked up on the second ring. "Always." "Mummy, I need you to tell me about Seoul." Silence. Not the silence of someone who didn't understand. The silence of someone who had been waiting 28 years to hear it asked. "I have the photograph. I have the documents. I know about Benjamin and the arrangement, and I know you took me in the middle of the night." A long pause. Then Faith exhaled, a sound Grace had never heard from her mother before. Something released. Something held so carefully and for so long that the releasing of it sounded almost like pain. "I always knew," Faith said softly, "that Seoul would find you eventually." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were mine." Her mother's voice was quiet and fierce and full of something Grace felt move through her chest like heat. "You were always mine, and I was not going to let you grow up feeling like a piece of an arrangement, like something bargained for. You deserved to simply be Grace, just Grace, my daughter. And you left, with nothing." "With everything," Faith said firmly. "I left with you." She saw the 4 words on the back. Seoul. 1997. Don't forget. Not a message for anyone else. A reminder to herself. A woman telling herself not to forget what she had survived. "I'm in Seoul, Mummy," she said softly. "And I'm starting to understand why." She went back to her desk and worked steadily for 3 hours, because she was still Grace Adeyemi, because life continued to require showing up for it. At 6 p.m., her desk phone rang. "Come up," Ji-hoon said, "please." Still unpolished, still arriving before he could decide whether to send it. He was at the window, Seoul gold and dark outside, evening settling over the city like something being folded carefully away. He turned when she entered, and his eyes moved over her face the way they always did, reading her, seeing more than she consciously offered. "Are you all right?" The question, simple, direct, absent of all the power and danger, made something pull tight in her throat. "I will be," she said. "Are you?" He looked surprised, then not surprised, then something softer than either. "I will be," he said. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, not touching, not needing to. Simply standing in the same space, looking at the same city, carrying 2 versions of the same inheritance. "My father's final file," Ji-hoon said. The classified one my investigator has been sitting on for 3 weeks. I received it this morning. And you waited all day to tell me. I didn't want to hand you something I hadn't looked at properly myself. Grace felt that move through her in a way she didn't try to stop. He reached into his jacket and removed a single folded sheet. On held it. The same careful moment as before. The same awareness of handing over something that could not be taken back. My father did not simply want you raised in Seoul as a guarantee. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. What was the whole truth? He believed, he had been told by someone he trusted, that you would be the one to legitimize everything he built. That one day the Kwon name and the Adeyemi name, bound together, it would be the thing that finally made the empire clean. He believed in you, Ji-hoon said, before you existed. He wrote it down, built it into his plans, and when your mother took you and disappeared, he didn't chase her. Why not? Because he wrote one final note, the last thing he ever wrote about this. He unfolded the paper, or read it aloud, his voice quiet and steady, and carrying the weight of a man who had read these words alone this morning and needed to say them to another person before they finished meaning something only to him. If she is anything like her mother, she will find her way here herself, and it will be real, or it will be nothing. The words settled into the room like something coming to rest after a very long journey. His Grace stood at the window with Seoul burning gold below and felt every piece of it arrive simultaneously. The photograph, the files, her name in a dead man's handwriting, Faith in the middle of the night with an infant and nothing else, and this man beside her who had found her name and crossed the city to see if she was real and had been undone, quietly and completely, by the fact that she was. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "It's real," she said quietly. Something in Ji-hoon's face broke open, fully, completely, with nothing left to manage or control, and he reached up and touched her face with one hand, just briefly, the way you touch something you have been afraid to believe in. "I know," he said. And somewhere in Lagos, Faith's phone lit up with a message from her daughter. 3 words. "I found him." Faith read it once, set the phone down, pressed both hands flat against the kitchen table the way Grace always did when she was holding something together. Then she smiled, open and unguarded and complete, the way she had smiled in a photograph taken in that city a lifetime ago, and let the tears come quietly, alone in her kitchen, for everything she had carried and everything she had protected, and everything that had, against all odds and across all that distance, found its way home. She was still smiling when her front door opened. She hadn't heard a knock. She turned. A man stood in her doorway, Korean, older, dressed in a suit that said money and eyes that said something considerably darker than money. Behind him, 2 more men, silent, still, the kind of still that was its own kind of threat. Faith's smile disappeared. "Mrs. Faith," the man said quietly in careful English, "my employer would like to speak with your daughter." "Oh, we've been sent to make sure that happens." Faith stood up slowly from the table. "Who is your employer?" The man looked at her the way people look at questions they find unnecessary. "Someone who knew you, a long time ago." A pause. "Someone who never forgot what you took when you left Seoul." Faith's hand moved to her phone on the table. The man shook his head once, slowly. "I wouldn't," he said softly. "Not yet." In Seoul, 42 floors above the city, Grace leaned just slightly into Ji-hoon's hand against her face and felt for the first time in 6 months like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not know that 3 men had just walked into her mother's house in Lagos. She did not know that the part of Ji-hoon's empire he had been trying to step away from had just reached across an ocean. She did not know that the arrangement their families made in 1996 had never been about love. It had been about a debt. And the debt was now being collected. If this story reached into your chest and took something, you already know what to do. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you think happens next. We read every single one.